Good evening, and welcome to Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's installment provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep for once. So lie back, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath, and off we go. This evening we're reading a book recommended by one of your fellow listeners, and I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. We're reading The Cricket Field, or The History and the Science of the Game of Cricket, by James Pycroft, the author of The Principles of Scientific Batting, Recollections of College Days, etc., etc., second edition, published by Longman, Brown, Green and Longmans, London, 1854. Let's begin. Dedicated to J.A.B. Marshall, Esquire, and the members of the Lansdowne Cricket Club, by one of their oldest members and sincere friend, the author. Quote, "'Twas in the prime of summertime, an evening calm and cool, and 25 happy boys came bounding out of school. Away they sped with gamesome minds and souls untouched with sin. To a level mead they came, and there they drove the wickets in." End quote. Preface to the second edition. This edition is greatly improved by various additions and corrections, for which we gratefully acknowledge our obligations to the Reverend R.T. King and Mr. A. Haygarth, as also once more to Mr. A. Bass and Mr. Watley of Burton, for our practical instructions on bowling, batting, and fielding. The first players of the day have been consulted, each on the point in which he respectively excelled. More discoveries have also been made illustrative of the origin and early history of cricket, and we trust nothing is wanting to maintain the high character now accorded to the cricket field as the standard authority on every part of our national game. James Pycroft, May 18th, 1854. Preface to the first edition. The following pages are devoted to the history and the science of our national game. Isaac Walton has added a charm to the rod and line, Colonel Hawker to the dog and the gun, and Nimrod and Harry Highover to the hunting field. But the cricket field is to this day untrodden ground. We have been long expecting to hear of some chronicler aided and abetted by the noblemen and gentlemen of the Marylebone Club, one who should combine with all the resources of a ready writer, traditionary lore, and practical experience. But time is fast thinning the ranks of the veterans. Lord Frederick Beauclerk and the once celebrated player, the Honourable Henry Tufton, afterwards Earl of Thanet, have passed away, and probably Sparks of the Edinburgh ground and Mr. John Goldham, hereinafter mentioned, are the only surviving players who have witnessed both the formation and the jubilee of the Marylebone Club, following as it has the fortunes of the Pavilion and of the enterprising Thomas Lord, literally through 3 removes and 1 fire, from White Conduit Fields to the present Lords. How then, it will be asked, do we presume to save from oblivion the records of cricket? As regards the antiquities of the game, our history is the result of patient researches in Old English literature. As regards its changes and chances and the players of olden time, it fortunately happens that some 15 years ago we furnished ourselves with old Nyron's account of the cricketers of his time and the Hambledon Club, and using Bentley's Book of Matches from 1786 to 1825 to suggest questions and test the truth of answers, we passed many an interesting hour in Hampshire and Surrey by the peat fires of those villages which reared the Walkers, David Harris, Beldam, Wells, and some others of the All England players of 50 years since. Bennett, Harry Hampton, Beldam and Sparks, who first taught us to play, all men of the last century, have at various times contributed to our earlier annals, while Thomas Beagley, for some days our landlord, the late Mr. Ward, and especially Mr. E. H. Budd, often our antagonist in Lansdowne matches, have respectively assisted in the first 20 years of the present century. But distinct mention must we make of one most important chronicler, whose recollections were coextensive with the whole history of the game in its matured and perfect form, William Fenix. And here we must thank our kind friend, the Reverend John Mitford of Benhall, for his memoranda of many a winter's evening with that fine old player, papers especially valuable because Fenix's impressions were so distinct, and his observations so correct, that added to his practical illustrations with bat and ball, no other man could enable us so truthfully to compare ancient with modern times. Old Fenix, in his declining years, was hospitably appointed by Mr. Mitford to a sinecure office, created expressly in his honor, in the beautiful gardens of Benhall, and Pilch and Box and Bailey and all of his old acquaintance will not be surprised to hear that the old man would carefully water and roll his little cricket ground on summer mornings, and on wet and wintry days would sit in the chimney corner, dealing over and over again by the hour to an imaginary partner a very dark and dingy pack of cards, and would then sally forth to teach a long-remembered lesson to some hobnailed frequenter of the village alehouse. So much for the history, but why should we venture on the science of the game? Many may be excellently qualified and have a fund of anecdote and illustration. Still not one of the many will venture on a book. Hundreds play without knowing principles. Many know what they cannot explain, and some could explain, but fear the certain labor and cost with the most uncertain return of authorship. For our own part, we have felt our way. The wide circulation of our Recollections of College Days and Course of English Reading promises a patient hearing on subjects within our proper sphere, and that in this sphere lies cricket, we may without vanity presume to assert. For in August last, at Mr. Dark's repository at Lord's, our little treatise on the principles of scientific batting, Slatter, Oxford, 1835, was singled out as the book which contained as much on cricket as all that had ever been written and more besides. That same day did we proceed to arrange with Messrs. Longman, naturally desirous to lead a second advance movement, as we led the first, and to break the spell which, we had thus been assured, had for 15 years chained down the invention of literary cricketers at the identical point where we left off. For not a single rule or principle has yet been published in advance of our own, though more than one author has been kind enough to adopt, thinking no doubt the parents were dead, our ideas and language too. Shall we ever make new books, asks Tristram Shandy, as apothecaries make new mixtures, By pouring only out of one vessel into another? No, but so common is the failing that actually even this illustration of plagiarism Sterne stole from Burton. Like solitary travelers from unknown lands, we are naturally desirous to offer some confirmation of statements, depending otherwise too much on our literary honor. We happily have received the following from, we believe, the oldest player of the day who can be pronounced a good player still, Mr. E. H. Budd. Quote, I return the proof sheets of the history of my contemporaries, and can truly say that they do indeed remind me of old times. I find one thing only to correct, which I hope you will be in time to alter, for your accuracy will then, to the best of my belief, be wholly without exception. Write 20 guineas, and not 25 as the sum offered by old Thomas Lord, if any one should hit out of his ground where now is Dorset Square. You invite me to note further particulars for your second edition. The only omission I can at present detect is this: the name of Lord George Carr, son of the Marquess of Lothian, should be added to your list of the patrons of the old Surrey players, for his lordship lived in the midst of them at Farnham, and I have often heard beldam say, used to provide bread and cheese and beer for as many as would come out and practice on a summer's evening. This is too substantial a supporter of the noble game to be forgotten. End quote. We must not conclude without grateful acknowledgments to some distinguished amateurs representing the science both of the northern and the southern counties, who have kindly allowed us to compare notes on various points of play. In all of our instructions in batting, we have greatly benefited by the assistance, in the first instance, of Mr. A. Bass of Burton, and his friend Mr. Watley, a gentleman who truly understands philosophy in sport. Then the Honorable Robert Grimston judiciously suggested some modification to our plan. We agreed with him that for a popular work, and one for play hours, the lighter part should prevail over the heavier, for with most persons a little science goes a long way, and our winged words, if made too weighty, might not fly far, seeing, as said Thucydides, men do find it such a bore to learn anything that gives them trouble. For these reasons we drew more largely on our funds of anecdote and illustration, which had been greatly enriched by the contributions of a highly valued correspondent, Mr. E. S. E. Hartop. When thus the science of batting had been reduced to its fair proportions, it was happily undertaken by the Honorable Frederick Ponsonby, not only through kindness to ourselves personally, but also, we feel assured, because he takes a pleasure in protecting the interests of the rising generation. By his advice, we became more distinct in our explanations, and particularly careful of venturing on such refinements of science as, though sound in theory, may possibly produce errors in practice. For our artist we have one word to say, not indeed for the engravings in our frontispiece, these having received unqualified approbation, but we allude to the illustrations of attitudes. In vain did our artist assure us that a foreshortened position would defy every attempt at ease, energy, or elegance. We felt bound to insist on sacrificing the effect of the picture to its utility as an illustration. Our principal design is to show the position of the feet and bat with regard to the wicket, and how every hit, with one exception, the cut, is made by no other change of attitude than results from the movement of the left foot alone. James Pycroft, Barnstaple, April 15th, 1851. The Cricket Field, Chapter 1, Origin of the Game of Cricket. The game of cricket in some rude form is undoubtedly as old as the 13th century, but whether at that early date cricket was the name it generally bore is quite another question, for club ball we believe to be the name which usually stood for cricket in the 13th century, though at the same time we have some curious evidence that the term cricket at that early period was also known, but the identity of the game with that now in use is the chief point. The name is of secondary consideration. Games commonly change their names, as every schoolboy knows, and bear different appellations in different places. Nevertheless, all previous writers acquiescing quietly in the opinion of Strutt, expressed in his Sports and Pastimes, not only forget that cricket may be older than its name, but erroneously suppose that the name of cricket occurs in no author in the English language of an earlier date than Thomas Durfee, who, in his Pills to Purge Melancholy, writes thus, quote, Hare was the prettiest fellow at football and at cricket. At hunting chase or nimble race, how featly Hare could prick it. End quote. The words, how featly, Strutt properly writes in place of a revolting old-fashioned oath in the original. Strutt, therefore, in these lines quotes the word cricket as first occurring in 1710. About the same date, Pope wrote, quote, The judge to dance his brother sergeants call, the senators at cricket urge the ball. End quote. And Duncombe, curious to observe, laying the scene of a match near Canterbury, wrote, quote, An ill-timed cricket match there did at Bishopsbourne befall. End quote. Soame Jennings also, early in the same century, wrote in lines that showed that cricket was very much of a sporting amusement. Quote, England, when once at peace and wealth possessed, began to think frugality a jest, so grew polite, hence all her well-bred airs, gamesters and jockeys turned, and cricket players. End quote. However, we are happy to say that even among comparatively modern authors, we have beaten Strutt in his researches by 25 years. For Edward Phillips, John Milton's nephew, in his Mysteries of Love and Eloquence, 1685, writes thus, quote, Will you not, when you have me, throw stocks at my head and cry, Would my eyes had been beaten out of my head with a cricket ball the day before I saw thee. End quote. We shall presently show the word cricket in Richelet as early as the year 1680. A late author has very sensibly remarked that cricket could not have been popular in the days of Elizabeth, or we should expect to find allusions to that game, as to tennis, football, and other sports in the early poets. But Shakespeare and the dramatists who followed, he observes, are silent on the subject. As to the silence of the early poets and dramatists on the game of cricket, and no one conversant with English literature would expect to find it except in some casual allusion or illustration in an old play, this silence we can confirm on the best authority. What if we presume to advance that the early dramatists, one and all, ignore the very name of cricket? How bold a negative! So rare are certain old plays that £100 have been paid by the Duke of Devonshire for a single copy of a few loose and soiled leaves. And shall we pretend to have dived among such hidden stores? We are so fortunate as to be favored with the assistance of the Reverend John Mitford and our loving cousin John Payne Collier, two English scholars, most deeply versed in early literature, and no bad judges of cricket. And since these two scholars have never met with any mention of cricket in the early dramatists, nor in any author earlier than 1685, there is indeed much reason to believe that cricket is a word that does not occur in any English author before the year 1685. But though it occurs not in any English author, is it found in no rare manuscript yet unpublished? We shall see. Now, as regards the silence of the early poets, a game like cricket might certainly exist without falling in with the allusions or topics of poetical writers. Still, if we actually find distinct catalogues and enumerations of English games before the date of 1685, and cricket is omitted, the suspicion that cricket was not then the popular name of one of the many games of ball, not that the game itself was positively unknown, is strongly confirmed. 6 such catalogues are preserved, one in the Anatomy of Melancholy, a second in a well-known treatise of James I, and a third in the Cotswold Games, with 3 others. For the first catalogue, Strutt reminds us of the set of rules from the hand of James I for the nurture and conduct of an heir apparent to the throne, addressed to his eldest son Henry, Prince of Wales, called The King's Christian Duty Towards God. Herein the king forbids gaming and rough play. Quote, "As to dicing, I think it becometh best debauched soldiers to play on the heads of their drums. As to the football, it is meeter for laming than making able the users thereof." End quote. But a special commendation is given to certain games of ball, playing at the catch or tennis, pall mall, and such like other fair and pleasant field games. Certainly cricket may have been included under the last general expression, though by no means a fashionable game in James's reign. For the second catalogue of games, Burton in his Anatomy of Melancholy, "the only book," said Dr. Johnson, "that ever took me out of bed 2 hours sooner than I wished to rise," gives a view of the sports most prevalent in the 17th century. Here we have a very full enumeration. It specifies the pastimes of great men and those of base inferior persons. It mentions the rocks on which men lose themselves by gambling, how wealth runs away with their hounds, and their fortunes fly away with their hawks. Then follow the sights and shows of the Londoners, and the May games and recreations of the country folk. More minutely still, Burton speaks of rope dancers, cockfights, and other sports common both to town and country. Still, though Burton is so exact as to specify all winter recreation separately, and mentions even footballs and balloons, saying, "Let the common people play at ball and barley breaks," there is in all this catalogue no mention whatever of cricket. As a third catalogue, we have the Cotswold Games, but cricket is not among them. This was an annual celebration which one Captain Dover, by express permission and command of James I, held on the Cotswold Hills in Gloucestershire. Fourthly, cricket is not mentioned in the Complete Gamester, published by Charles Brown in 1709. Fifthly, I have many editions of Chamberlain's State of England, kindly writes Mr. T.B. Macaulay, published between 1670 and 1700, and I observe he never mentions cricket among the national games, of which he gives a long list. The great John Locke wrote in 1679, quote, "The sports of England for a curious stranger to see are horse racing, hawking, hunting, and bowling. At Marylebone and Putney he may see several persons of quality bowling 2 or 3 times a week. Also, wrestling in Lincoln's Inn Fields every evening, bear and bull baiting at the Bear Garden, shooting with the longbow, and stob ball in Tuttle Fields, and cudgel playing in the country, and hurling in Cornwall." End quote. Here again we have no cricket. Stob ball is a very different game. Nevertheless, we have a catalogue of games of about 1700 in Stowe's Survey of London, and there cricket is mentioned. But remarkably enough, it is particularized as one of the amusements of the lower classes. The whole passage is curious. Quote, "The modern sports of the citizens, besides drinking, are cockfighting, bowling upon greens, backgammon, cards, dice, billiards, also musical entertainments, dancing, masks, balls, stage plays, and club meetings in the evening. They sometimes ride out on horseback and hunt with the Lord Mayor's pack of dogs when the common hunt goes on. The lower classes divert themselves at football, wrestling, cudgels, ninepins, shovelboard, cricket, stowball, ringing of bells, quoits, pitching the bar, bull and bear baitings, throwing at cocks, and lying at alehouses." End quote. The lawyers have a rule that to specify one thing is to ignore the other, and this rule of evidence can never be more applicable than where a sport is omitted from 6 distinct catalogues. Therefore, the conclusion that cricket was unknown when those lists were made would indeed appear utterly irresistible. Only audi semper alterum partem. In this case, the argument would prove too much, for it would equally prove that club ball and trap ball were undiscovered too, whereas both these games are confessedly as old as the 13th century. The conclusion of all this is that the oft-repeated assertion that cricket is a game no older than the 18th century is erroneous. For first, the thing itself may be much older than its name, and secondly, the silence of antiquity is no conclusive evidence that even the name of cricket was really unknown. Thus do we refute those who assert a negative as to the antiquity of cricket. And now for our affirmative. We are prepared to show, first, that a single-wicket game was played as early as the 13th century under the name of club ball. Secondly, that it might have been identical with a sport of the same date called hand in and hand out. Thirdly, that a genuine double-wicket game was played in Scotland about 1700 under the name of cat and dog. Fourthly, that crick, very nearly cricket, the Saxon term for the crooked stick or bandy which we see in the old pictures of cricket, was the name of a game played in the year 1300. First, as to the single-wicket game in the 13th century, whatever the name of the said game might have been, we are quite satisfied with the following proof. Quote, "In the Bodleian Library at Oxford," says Strutt, "is a manuscript, number 264, dated 1344, which represents a figure of female in the act of bowling a ball of the size of a modern cricket ball to a man who elevates a straight bat to strike it. Behind the bowler are several figures, male and female, waiting to stop or catch the ball, their attitudes grotesquely eager for a chance. The game is called club ball, but the score is made by hitting and running as in cricket." End quote. Secondly, Barrington, in his remarks on the more ancient statutes, comments on the Edward IV 17th manuscript 1477 thus, quote, "The disciplined soldiers were not only guilty of pilfering on their return, but also of the vice of gaming. The third chapter therefore forbids playing at cloish, regal, half-bowl, quick-aboard, hand-in and hand-out. Whosoever shall permit these games to be played in their house or yard is punishable with 3 years' imprisonment. Those who play at any of the said games are to be fined £10 or lie in jail 2 years." End quote. This, says Barrington, is the most severe law ever made in any country against gaming, and some of those forbidden seem to have been manly exercises, particularly the hand-in and hand-out, which I should suppose to be a kind of cricket, as the term hands is still, writing in 1740, retained in that game. Thirdly, as to the double-wicket game, Dr. Jameson, in his dictionary published in 1722, gives the following account of a game played in Angus and Lothian. Quote, "This is a game for 3 players at least, who are furnished with clubs. They cut out 2 holes, each about a foot in diameter and 7 inches in depth, and 26 feet apart. One man guards each hole with his club. These clubs are called dogs. A piece of wood about 4 inches long and 1 inch diameter, called a cat, is pitched by a third person from one hole towards the player at the other, who is to prevent the cat from getting into the hole. If it pitches in the hole, the party who threw it takes his turn with the club. If the cat be struck, the club bearers change places, and each change of place counts 1 to the score, like club ball." End quote. The last observation shows that in the game of club ball above mentioned, the score was made by runs, as in cricket. In what respect, then, do these games differ from cricket as played now? The only exception that can be taken is the absence of any wicket. But everyone familiar with a paper given by Mr. Ward and published in Old Nyren by the talented Mr. C. Cowden Clarke will remember that the traditionary block hole was a veritable hole in former times, and that the batsman was made out in running, not as now by putting down a wicket, but by popping the ball into the hole before the bat was grounded in it. The same paper represents that the wicket was 2 feet wide, a width which is only rendered credible by the fact that the said hole was not like our mark for guard, 4 feet distant from the stumps, but cut like a basin in the turf between the stumps, an arrangement which would require space for the frequent struggle of the batsman and wicket-keeper as to whether the bat of the one or the hand of the other should reach the block hole first. The conclusion of all is that cricket is identical with club ball, a game played in the 13th century as single wicket, and played, if not then, somewhat later as a double wicket game, that where balls were scarce, a cat or bit of wood, as seen in many a village, supplied its place. Also that hand-in and hand-out was probably only another name. Fosbrook, in his Dictionary of Antiquities, said club ball was the ancestor of cricket. He might have said club ball was the old name for cricket, the games being the same. The points of difference are not greater than every cricketer can show between the game as now played and that of the last century. But lastly, as to the name of cricket, the bat which is now straight is represented in old pictures as crooked, and cricket is the simple Saxon word for a crooked stick. The derivation of billiards from the Northman billart, a cue, or from bolyard, according to Johnson. Also ninepins and trap ball are obvious instances of games which derived their names from the implements with which they are played. Now it appears highly probable that the crooked stick used in the game of bandy might have been gradually adopted, especially when a wicket to be bowled down by a rolling ball superseded the block hole to be pitched into. In that case, the club having given way to the bandy or crooked bat of the last century, the game, which first was named from the club ball, might afterwards have been named from the bandy or crooked stick cricket. Add to which, the game might have been played in two ways, sometimes more in the form of club ball, sometimes more like cricket, and the following remarkable passages prove that a term very similar to cricket was applied to some game as far back as the 13th century, the identical date to which we have traced that form of cricket called club ball, and the game of hand in and hand out. From the Gentleman's Magazine, Volume 58, page 1, 1788, we extract the following. The writer observes that the glossaries have been searched in vain for any other name of a pastime but cricket to which the term creag can apply. And why should it not be cricket? For we have a singular evidence that, at the same date, Merlin the magician was a cricketer. In the Romance of Merlin, a book in very old French, written about the time of Edward I, is the following, quote, "Two of Vortigern's emissaries fell in with certain children who were playing at cricket," end quote. Quoted in Dunlop's History of Fiction, the word here rendered cricket is lacrosse, and in Richelieu's dictionary of 1680 are these words: crosse, à crosier, bâton de bois courbé par le bout d'un hôte, dont on se sert pour jouer ou pousser quelques balles. Crosseur, qui pousse, cricketer. Creag and cricket, therefore, being presumed identical, the cricketers of Warwick and of Gloucester may be reminded that they are playing the same game as was played by the dauntless enemy of Robert Bruce, afterwards the prisoner at Kenilworth, and eventually the victim of Mortimer's ruffians in the dark tragedy of Berkeley Castle. To advert to a former observation that cricket was originally confined to the lower orders, Robert Southey notes that cricket was not deemed a game for gentlemen in the middle of the last century. Tracing this allusion to the Connoisseur, number 132, dated 1756, we are introduced to one Mr. Toby Bumper, whose vulgarities are drinking purl in the morning, eating black puddings at Bartholomew Fair, boxing with Buckhorse, and also that he is frequently engaged at the artillery ground with Faulkner and Dingett at cricket, and is esteemed as good a bat as either of the Bennets. Dingett will be mentioned as an All-England player in our third chapter. Our game in later times, we know, has constituted the pastime and discipline of many an English soldier. Our barracks are now provided with cricket grounds. Every regiment and every man of war has its club, and our soldiers and sailors astonish the natives of every clime, both inland and maritime, with a specimen of a British game, and it deserves to be better known that it was at a cricket match that some of our officers were amusing themselves on the 12th of June, 1815, says Captain Gordon, quote, in company with that devoted cricketer, the Duke of Richmond, when the Duke of Wellington arrived, and shortly after came the Prince of Orange, which of course put a stop to our game. Though the hero of the peninsula was not apt to let his movements be known, on that occasion he made no secret that, if he were attacked from the south, Hala would be his position, and if on the Namur side, Waterloo. End quote. Chapter 2. The General Character of Cricket. The game of cricket, philosophically considered, is a standing panegyric on the English character. None but an orderly and sensible race of people would so amuse themselves. It calls into requisition all the cardinal virtues, some moralist would say. As with the Grecian games of old, the player must be sober and temperate. Patience, fortitude, and self-denial, the various bumps of order, obedience, and good humor, with an unruffled temper, are indispensable. For intellectual virtues we want judgment, decision, and the organ of concentrativeness. Every faculty in the free use of all its limbs, and every idea in constant air and exercise. Poor, rickety, and stunted wits will never serve. The widest shoulders are of little use without a head upon them. The cricketer wants wits down to his fingers' ends. As to physical qualifications, we require not only the volatile spirits of the Irishman rampant, nor the phlegmatic caution of the Scotchman couchant, but we want the English combination of the two, though with good generalship, cricket is a game for Britons generally. The three nations would mix not better in a regiment than in an 11, especially if the Hibernian were trained in London and taught to enjoy something better than what Father Prout terms his supreme felicity, otium cum dig gentates. It was from the southern and southeastern counties of England that the game of cricket spread, not a little owing to the propaganda of the metropolitan clubs, which played chiefly first at the artillery ground, then at White Conduit Fields, and thirdly at Thomas Lord's grounds, of which there were two before the present Lords, as well as latterly at the Oval, Kennington, and on all sides of London, through all the southern half of England, and during these last 20 years the northern counties, and even Edinburgh, have sent forth distinguished players. But considering that the complement of the game is 22 men, besides 2 umpires and 2 scorers, and considering also that cricket, unlike every other manly contest, by flood or field, occupies commonly more than one day, the railways, as might be expected, have tended wonderfully to the diffusion of cricket, giving rise to clubs depending on a circle of some 30 or 40 miles, and also to that club in particular under the canonized saint John Zingari, into whom are supposed to have migrated all the erratic spirits of the gypsy tribe. The Zingari are a race of ubiquitous cricketers, exclusively gentlemen players. For cricket affords to a race of professionals a merry and abundant, though rather a laborious livelihood, from the time the first mayfly is up to the time the first pheasant is down. Neither must we forget the All England and United Elevens, who under the generalship of Clark or Wisden play numbers varying from 14 to 22 in almost every county in England. So proud are provincial clubs of this honor that besides a subscription of some £70, and part or all of the money at the field gate being willingly accorded for their services, much hospitality is exercised wherever they go. This tends to a healthy circulation of the life's blood of cricket, vaccinating and inoculating every wandering rustic with the principles of the national game. Our soldiers, we said, by order of the Horse Guards, are provided with cricket grounds adjoining their barracks, and all of Her Majesty's ships have bats and balls to astonish the cockroaches at sea and the crabs and turtles ashore. Hence it has come to pass that wherever Her Majesty's servants have carried their victorious arms and legs, wind and weather permitting, cricket has been played. Still, the game is essentially Anglo-Saxon. Foreigners have rarely, very rarely imitated us. The English settlers and residents everywhere play, but of no single cricket club have we ever heard dieted either with frogs, sauerkraut, or macaroni. But how remarkable that cricket is not naturalized in Ireland. The fact is very striking that it follows the course rather of ale than whiskey. Witness Kent, the land of hops, and the annual antagonists of all England. Secondly, Farnham, which, as we shall presently show with its adjoining parishes, nurtured the finest of the old players, as well as the finest hops, Connabula Troje, the infant school of cricketers. Witness also the Burton clubs, assisted by our excellent friend next akin to bitter ale. Witness again Alton ale, on which old Beagley throws so well, and the Scotch ale of Edinburgh, on which John Sparks, though commencing with the last generation, has carried on his instructions, in which we ourselves once rejoiced, into the middle of the present century. The mountain mists and mountain dew suit better with deer stalking than with cricket. Our game disdains the Dutch courage of ardent spirits. The brain must glow with nature's fire and not depend upon a spirit lamp. Mens sana in corpore sano. Feed the body, but do not cloud the mind. You, sir, with the hectic flush, the fire of your eyes burnt low in their sockets, with beak as sharp as a woodcock's from living upon suction, with pallid face and shaky hand, our game disdains such ghost-like votaries. Rise with the lark and scent the morning air, and drink from the bubbling rill, and then, when your veins are no longer fevered with alcohol, nor puffed with tobacco smoke, when you have rectified your illicit spirits and clarified your unsettled judgment, come again and devour up my discourse. And you, sir, with the figure of Falstaff and the nose of Bardolph, not Christianly eating that you may live, but living that you may eat, one of the nati consumere fruges, the devouring caterpillar and grub of humankind, our noble game has no sympathy with gluttony, still less with the habitual diner out, on whom outraged nature has taken vengeance by emblazoning what was his face, nimium ne crede colori, encasing each limb in fat, and condemning him to be his own porter to the end of his days. Then I am your man, and I, cry a crowd of self-satisfied youths. Sound are we in wind and limb, and none have quicker hand or eye. Gently, my friends, so far well. Good hands and eyes are instruments indispensable, but only instruments. There is a wide difference between a good workman and a bag of tools, however sharp. We must have heads as well as hands. You may be big enough and strong enough, but the question is whether, as Virgil says, quote, Spiritus intus alit, totamque infusa per artus, mens agitat molem, et magno se corpore missit. End quote. And in these lines, Virgil truly describes the right sort of man for a cricketer. Plenty of life in him, not barely soul enough, as Robert South said, to keep his body from putrefaction. But however large his stature, though he weigh 20 stone, like, we will not say Mr. Min, but an olden wicket-keeper named Bert, or a certain infant genius in the same line of good Cambridge town, he must, like these worthies aforesaid, have in perfection and be instinct with sense all over. Then, says Virgil, igneus est olus vigor. They must always have the steam up. Otherwise the bard would have agreed with us. They are no good in an 11, because, quote, Noxia corpora tardent, terrenique habitant artus, moribundaque membra. End quote. That is, you must suspend the laws of gravitation before they can stir, dull clods of the valley, and so many stone of carrion. And then Virgil proceeds to describe what discipline will render those who suffer the penalties of idleness or intemperance fit to join the chosen few in the cricket field. Quote, Exinde per amplum, mitamur elysium et possi leta arva tenemus. End quote. Of course, Elysium means lords, and leta arva, the shooting fields. We make no apology for classical quotations. At the universities, cricket and scholarship very generally go together. When, in 1836, we played victoriously on the site of Oxford against Cambridge, 7 out of our 11 were classmen, and it is doubtless only to avoid an invidious distinction that heads versus heels, as was once suggested, has failed to be an annual university match, though the serie studiorum, those put to school late, would not have a chance. We extract the following, quote, In a late convocation holden at Oxford, May 30th, 1851, it was agreed to affix the university seal to a power of attorney authorizing the sale of £2,000, 3%, for the purpose of paying for and enclosing certain allotments of land in Cowley Common, used as cricket grounds by members of the university, in order to their being preserved for that purpose, and let to the several university cricket clubs in such manner as may hereafter appear expedient. End quote. From all this, we argue that, on the authority of ancient and the experience of modern times, cricket wants mind as well as matter, and in every sense of the word a good understanding. How is it that Clark's slow bowling is so successful? Ask Bailey or Caldecourt, or say Bailey's own bowling, or that of Lillywhite, or others not much indebted to pace. You see, sir, they bowl with their heads. Then only is the game worthy the notice of full-grown men. A rubber of whist, says the author of the Diary of a Late Physician in his law studies, calls into requisition all those powers of mind that a barrister most needs, and nearly as much may be said of a scientific game of cricket. Mark that first-rate bowler. The batsman is hankering for his favorite cut. No, leg stump is attacked again. Extra man on leg side. Right, that's the spot. Leg stump and not too near him. He is screwed up and cannot cut away. point has it. Persevere, try again, his patience soon will fail. Ah, look at that ball. The bat was more out of the perpendicular. Now the bowler alters his pace, good. A dropping ball, overreached and all but a mistake. Now a slower pace still, with extra twist. Hits furiously to leg, too soon. Leg stump is grazed and bail off. You see, sir, says the veteran, turning round. An old player who knows what is and what is not on the ball alone can resist all the temptations that leg balls involve. Young players are going their round of experiments and are too fond of admiration and brilliant hits, whereas it is your upright straight players that worry a bowler. 22 inches of wood by 4 1/4, every inch of them before the stumps, hitting or blocking, is rather disheartening. But the moment a man makes ready for a leg hit, only about 5 inches by 4 of wood can cover the wicket. So leg hitting is the bowler's chance, cutting also for a similar reason. If there were no such thing as leg hitting, we should see a full bat every time, the man steady on his legs, and only one thing to think of, and what a task a bowler would have. That was Mr. Ward's play, good for something to the last. First-rate straight play and free leg hitting seldom last long together. When once exulting in the luxurious excitement of a leg volley, the muscles are always on the quiver to swipe round, and the bowler sees the bat raised more and more across wicket. So also it is with men who are yearning for a cut, forming for the cut like forming for leg hit. Aye, and almost the idea of those hits coming across the mind set the muscles off straight play and give the bowler a chance. There is a deal of head work in bowling. Once make your batsman set his mind on one hit and give him a ball requiring the contrary, and he is off his guard in a moment. And with that rather curious stream of consciousness passage, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the Cricket Field, or The History and Science of the Game of Cricket, by James Pycroft. As someone who knows nothing about the game of cricket except that it appears on BBC a lot, I found this fascinating, and I hope you did too. Nigel, thank you so much for this recommendation. If you'd like to read this book for yourself, you'll find a link to a free ebook version in the show notes, along with links to our Patreon account, where you can find out about perks exclusive to subscribers, including special monthly episodes found nowhere else. If you have a book you'd like to hear read like this one, the best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod. I'd really love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Until our next boring book, good night.